So we are at the top of the hour. I guess we can go on and get started. Hello, everyone. Happy Friday Eve. And on behalf of myself, the Accelerant team, our presenters and speakers here, we just want to welcome you to the Accelerant Research Virtual Insights Conference. My name is Krista. I am one of the senior project managers here. And just to give you a little bit of background about what we're doing today, how we got started, we first launched this event in about April of 2020. So that was when the uncertainty of COVID really hit. And there have obviously been quite some challenges with navigating what this new norm is. But a research gem that we found in all of this has just been the ability to connect, to reach out, and to speak with so many of you, even with the limitation of doing it virtually. We have an exceptional lineup of speakers today. I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Elissa from Lines of Life. She's going to start us off by discussing virtual focus groups, suicide, and ensuring participant safety. Around 1 o'clock, we'll have Jamie Peets with her experiences on collaborative synthesis in the financial services industry. And then around 2, Catherine Mezzo from Lowe's is going to talk about using card sorts to unlock cognitive models. We're really excited to just keep this ARVIC going. We're happy to host with fresh content each and every time we have one of these events. So please continue to stay with us throughout the afternoon, ask plenty of questions, share with your friends, and share with your colleagues. Just going to share my screen real quick because we have a few ground rules that we want to cover. And so, as you all know, we're doing this virtually. We are at the mercy of tech. So please just be mindful that some things might happen. We can't necessarily control it all, but we'll do our best in order to make sure that things run smoothly. In addition to that, just be respectful. We are going to open the chat for questions. So just be mindful of the questions you ask, the time and energy that our presenters and speakers have put into their presentations. And then just take advantage of this opportunity to network, to engage, to interact, and follow up with us. If you have additional questions at the end of each speaker's presentation, feel free to reach out and let us know. And again, so we're going to start off our presentations today with Elissa from Lines for Life. And we're so excited about what she has to share with us. Great content. Another presentation today at 1 o'clock from Jamie Peets. And then another presentation at 2 o'clock from Catherine Mezzo. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thanks again for being with us, Elissa. We're excited to have you. I'll let you take over now, and everyone just stay tuned, ask questions at the end of the presentation if they come up, and we'll be happy to facilitate those questions for you.
Greetings, honored and thrilled to be here and appreciative of all who have taken time today to join this presentation and address a topic that is intense, heavy, and impactful. I am calling in from Portland, Oregon on a wet, rainy, gray day. So please pop into chat your name, where you're from, and if there's any sunshine, do let me know because I will take any vitamin D, even virtual. Our topic today is virtual focus groups, discussing suicide and protecting participant safety. First, some background about the organization I am honored to serve. Lines for Life is a regional nonprofit dedicated to preventing substance abuse and suicide and promoting mental wellness. We envision a world where hope, health, and recovery are within reach of everyone. First, some background. Our organization has 3 categories of programs: crisis intervention center services. We run a contact call center 24/7 with over 30 lines. Our call takers the majority of whom are masters in social work level, are there to provide crisis de-escalation, in the very rare instances to call rescue if necessary, to provide emotional support and telecounseling. Our prevention services support partners, county, state, and regional, to reduce the prevalence of suicide and substance abuse. And this work today comes from our prevention branch. And finally, public policy and advocacy. We are working to end stigma and to shape more compassionate responses to substance abuse, suicide, and promote mental wellness. So addressing Oregon behavioral health needs in COVID, it has been a challenging series of months since COVID began. And fortunately, we had a strong foundation on which to build to support our state and community. In addition to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, we are Lines for Life is one of the call centers throughout the nation that answers that phone call for folks with an Oregon area code. We also have our alcohol and drug helpline, our military helpline, and our youth line. Our youth line is really unique in that it is one of the few organizations nationally where peer counselors, other youth, respond to youth text, calls, and chats between the hours of 4 and 10 p.m. In response to COVID, we grew, not surprisingly, as folks became increasingly concerned about depression, anxiety, and loneliness. We added a behavioral health support line, which provided 3 30-minute free sessions of telecounseling for those who are having challenges accessing services. We created drop-in support rooms for first-line responders, fire workers, healthcare workers, as well as those specific to BIPOC communities. We added a racial equity support line in response to the increasing dialogue and concerns around racial equity, discrimination, and increased community outreach to those underserved communities as well, African Americans and Hispanics here in Oregon. We also here in Oregon faced wildfires and had some specific disaster response for those crises as well. And finally, our senior loneliness line, which has been one of the fastest growing lines that before COVID was just specific to one county, was expanded statewide. It is through this connection of services that we have been working to meet the needs of all Oregonians. So just an update for those of you not in the field, the FCC recently approved a proposal that designates 988 as a mental health crisis hotline number. So just like 911, we now are achieving some mental health parity and have a more ready access to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline network of call centers. You'll see that phone number above my head. Please know that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available to anyone who is impacted by suicide, suicide loss, who is struggling with ideation, mental health crisis, or is concerned for a loved one. Our support call takers are there and available to answer those types of calls. So 988 will feed into this network of call centers such as Lines for Life, and we have great aspirations for improved coordination of care and services and increased mobile response. So this is not a state of the state on suicide. My goal here today is to talk about the methodological implications in virtual focus groups. But just briefly, suicide rates in the US are rising, and here in Oregon, as in many Western states, those rates are higher than the national average. This is true both for youth and for adults. The focus group work that I am presenting today feeds directly into adult suicide intervention prevention plan. That process is being led by the Oregon Health Authority and falls within our prevention and promotion programs. So what's important also to recognize as somebody who has conducted qualitative research for decades in really challenging topics, parenting children with chronic long-term long-term conditions, end-of-life care, racism experiences, that as someone who is relatively new to the field of suicide, having served in this role now for 2 years, it is a wickedly complex problem. The data definitions are murky, the data availability is delayed, and it is such a multivariate set of circumstances that lead to suicide that there are few evidence-based models, few predictive analytics, and insufficient samples to advance the field as rapidly as one might hope, given this trend of increase in suicide. So again, my focus today is on our prevention programs. I do want to highlight quickly the Suicide Rapid Response Initiative. One risk factor or risk when it comes to youth suicide is contagion, and people speak of suicide clusters. In response to having experienced that in some Oregon communities, the state developed a Suicide Rapid Response Program that Lines for Life hosts. That provides supports to a community that experienced a known youth suicide, in which our post-mention team goes in, meets with educators and community members who have contact with the youth in an effort to create drop-in centers, crisis response plans, communication plans, access to support groups and counseling to prevent contagion. This is a really innovative, policy-driven response to youth suicide here in Oregon. I'm going to talk a bit about some of these other programs as the presentation continues. So welcome to this presentation. Our learning objectives today are to understand why participant safety is an ongoing concern, to list some strategies for maintaining and monitoring safety virtually, to understand key elements of a safety protocol and provide a checklist that you could potentially use in your own work, know how and where to refer a person of concern. I work for Lines for Life. We have a clear mission. I have advocacy objectives as well. Those include increasing public understanding of suicide and mental health crisis, again, working to combat mental health stigma, encouraging adoption of safety protocols industry-wide, and recognizing that vicarious trauma also accrues for researchers. I wanted to begin with an example from a recent conference. Earlier this month, October 11th to 13th, Lines for Life hosted the Oregon Suicide Prevention Conference, providing a virtual forum for nearly 200 participants from throughout the state who are working on the front lines as veteran service officers, as county officials, as activists and advocates in community coalitions, as behavioral health providers to address suicide in their communities. So like many of us in the field of suicidology, when we host conferences, we know that our audience will include loss survivors, impacted family and friends, and those with lived experience themselves. We anticipate that audience and we recruit their participation. So as I go through an example of how we welcome and emphasize safety for this audience in the conference, this is an important framework and understanding of sort of what is standard in the field to think about that as a backdrop for the kind of research we do at our organization as well. So as I ask you to empathize and put yourself in the seat of folks in our audience, I also would ask you to consider who is in your audience and what is it about this topic that brought you here today? What are your concerns for participant safety? So welcome to the Oregon Suicide Prevention Conference. And as part of our plenary, we want to ask of you your support and assistance in affirming everyone's safety. We are a community. We're in this together. A reminder to introduce yourself, be present, connect on chat, ask questions, be there for each other. It is a huge help if you join breakout sessions on camera, but we recognize you need to do this as you can. If you need to eat, stretch, move, feel free to. But do know that visual cues help us monitor your safety. And if you are off camera, we may get concerned. So if you leave, do let us know with a spoken thank you or a typed BRB or bye-bye where you've headed. We also ask that you share appropriately for this virtual space and limited session time and summarize any lived experience or descriptions. A reminder that specific details can be distressing to others, and we ask you to be mindful when you share. And of course, most important, take care of you. If you find that emotions are arising, take a break, journal, reach out. We've built a number of ways that you can reach out, and we want you to know that we are here for you. Each breakout session has a moderator. That moderator is there to support and to provide one-on-one conversation in private chat as needed. We also host a drop-in emotional support room that offers one-to-one breakouts with a crisis counselor. There are daily scheduled sessions for wellness groups during breaks so that you can practice self-care in good company, meditation, breathing exercise. And finally, there is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That number is 1-800-273-8255. I encourage you all to enter it in your phone so that you have it available to you in the case there's ever a circumstance in which it is helpful. A reminder that this lifeline is available even after our meeting and conference is over, and it's confidential. In-conference support is not. But for real, that's an example of what we do in a conference, but we are discussing suicide today and safety matters. So I'm going to ask Krista if she could post the Lifeline and crisis text lines in chat. Text is great because if you need to reach out to support, you can still stay attentive and part of this virtual conversation. If you'd like some one-to-one attention, that is by far the best route. And again, those services are confidential. A reminder that we truly value lived experience and its wisdom, and we built our process to be inclusive of that. This presentation will include direct quotes from focus groups discussing suicide. Those quotes will follow safe messaging guidelines, and I will let you know before I share those slides. If you personally choose to share some lived experience in QA or chat, please do summarize and do not provide details or descriptions that others might find disturbing. Please share appropriately for this webinar format. So what to expect in this presentation today? I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the focus groups, what they were, what happened, and the recommendations that came out of them. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about one recent theory, one that is part of our crisis lines training about why suicide attempts and thoughts happen, so you have some background. A discussion of methods and strategies for conducting these focus groups on Zoom, resources, how and where to refer, and a reminder, this is not a suicide prevention course such as Safe Talk, QPR, Assist, or Mental Health First Aid. I'm a certified QPR instructor, and in the last 2 years have trained hundreds of educators, carpenters, the folks who answer the unemployment line in the state of Oregon, as well as coaches and community members who are working on the ground to prevent suicide. I encourage you to take those courses. There is nothing like being prepared, and that preparation is protective of you as well as the person you're hoping to support and help. So briefly, here is the list of focus groups that we conducted this spring, and you will see that not only the topic of suicide, but also the groups that we convened were struggling with some intense life experiences. Or the older adults group, we held 2 because we did not receive the level of participation we hoped. We collected during registration information information about folks' age as well as their regional geographic location in order to encourage some diversity across the state in those areas. But we did not screen for whether or not a person met this identity against any identity criteria. We left it to the person to opt into the identity group that resonated best for them. For example, we had veterans in the houselessness group and the attempt survivors group, as well as the veterans group. Interestingly, our older adult men opted out of the older adult identifications, but older adult identification, but into many of the other groups. We made an effort to use moderators who aligned with the identity group as possible. Okay. The objectives of the focus group were to surface and include perspectives that might otherwise be overlooked in state strategic planning, to elicit experiences that illustrate how suicide prevention works and does not work in practice, to think out loud and brainstorm approaches collaboratively. So here's an example of some of the questions we used on a scale of 1 to 10. How well does the state of Oregon support suicide prevention and intervention among veterans, attempt survivors, those who've experienced houselessness? What do you think are unique struggles of your group when it comes to mental health and suicide? And what motivated you to get support? What discouraged you? Those questions were extremely effective in gathering information about the health system and brainstorming solutions. So the next slides provide some direct quotes from the focus groups. This conversation has me thinking a lot about the importance of like a continuity of care. I am currently kind of the safe person of one of my friends who had a psych hold about a month ago. And then she really refuses to enter back into care because there was a change with medication. There was a change of treatment. There was a negative experience, again, feeling like, a prisoner in herself. And that just continues this cycle of trauma. And I don't know if there's a good solution around psych holds, but there certainly have to be better systems. So there can be communication with primary healthcare providers, with community support specialists. There just seems to be this real disconnect as a layperson helping someone in crisis navigate these systems. The person who first shared a story of a psych hold then chimed in support. Navigation, that was one of the biggest things for me. Who to talk to achieve things? How do I work through this system? So yes, navigator, please, that's the hardest part. Focus group participants also shared what was happening in the focus group and their appreciation for the opportunity to talk about their experiences. There's just a normalization that happens there around peers, like around here, like in this focus group. Nobody in this room is saying, oh my goodness, I can't believe you attempted. There's no feeling of like how giant and horrendous it is. Obviously, loss of life is a big deal, but if you've lived it, you know that it's a few bad steps away. And it's not something that should be like, yeah, horrifying to people. Obviously, loss of life is a big deal. But if you've lived it, you know that it's a few bad steps away. A final example of what we heard, as a whole system overview, it needs to be redone and rethought of in ways that are actually supportive towards healing and recovery for people. We need to decolonize this idea that we're just going to send sick people to a hospital. We need to have sick people surrounded by loved ones who are going to support them, and that there's people around that can support those loved ones to support their loved ones. It's layered, and I'd really love to see just more of that when we talk about community resources and where funding should go around helping crisis, and it just really looking at recovery as a long-term thing, not, okay, well, at least they're not in the hospital anymore. So just a quick check-in, Krista, are things moving more smoothly?
Everything is looking great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So again, our goal in developing these focus groups was to deliver policy recommendations and make sure that no one was overlooked in the development of those recommendations and ideas for the adult suicide intervention and prevention plan. A reminder from these focus group that came across really clear was everyone must be attuned to warning signs. That's similar to the prevention work we do in suicide prevention training. Similarly, what came out strongly is that the goal is not to prevent suicide. The goal is to build improved quality of life and satisfying, fulfilling futures. So implementing quality of life changes that created intergenerational community connection was also a priority, be they facilitated conversations or even urban design that encouraged that kind of connection. Raising awareness, improving visibility of services and resources, including end users in their planning, was also important. There was a understanding that folks did fall through the cracks, that they got overwhelmed when in crisis, and it was only through outreach and proactive identification that suicide prevention could occur. Expanding peer services across the continuum with a specific attention to respite care for folks who had been houseless. Just having four walls was a clear necessity for safety. Rewarding providers who stay in their roles, especially those working in rural areas. And again, mobile crisis response teams and drop-in centers that provide alternatives to 911 and emergency rooms, as well as addressing mandatory hospitalization and houselessness before it occurs, was intended to avoid adding trauma upon trauma. And finally, expanding follow-up care. That is one of the few evidence-based strategies in suicide prevention, post-crisis and beyond. It was clear that one of the most meaningful responses that folks got was after a crisis, folks reaching out to ask how they were doing. The learning objectives, why participant safety is a concern. I want to introduce here fluid vulnerability theory. That's a theory of suicide risk that has come about this century and really has changed the way we think about interventions. These slides come direct from our trainings of crisis line workers. So suicide risk has two dimensions: the baseline, or the predispositions, which is the set point for suicide risk. And you'll see that people's baselines differ, and that those who have a history of suicide attempts start at a higher baseline. And in fact, someone in acute crisis could just be at the baseline of another person. It's a really individualized model of risk. In an acute circumstance, an individual's short-term or current risk is aggravated by variables and supported by and protected by social and other factors. Fluid vulnerability theory is an emergent process. That means that it's dynamic. A great metaphor is a hurricane. It takes an exact set of temperature, air, wind, in combination that amplify each other for a perfect storm to occur. A reminder that change from a baseline to an acute state is nonlinear and dynamic, and it's best measured within a person as compared between people. Suicide episodes are time limited. It is an impulsive act, and often the intensity of that arousal lasts a period of as short as 5 minutes. So much of our crisis de-escalation work is focused on getting people through that short crisis. This theory was developed into a framework that looked at baseline predispositions as well as acute circumstances. And it is how these cognitive, emotional, physical, behavioral concerns interact that lead to an acute crisis. The trigger language and thinking through how people move from baseline to acute crisis is important. So it's when we are talking about these kinds of stressors, relationship problems, financial stress, perceived loss, that we need to be at added concern about accelerating folks into a crisis. Physical sensation and negative memories are also important contributors. The metaphor that I like to choose is about how to cook spaghetti al dente. I have a personal connection to the New York Times food columns. My aunt, Lucretia Mancuso, served as food service manager at the Times for over a decade. And so we followed the food columns with rapt attention in my household. And decades ago, one of their star columnists, Molly O'Neill, did a column on the kinds of cooking questions that she often got asked. And one that readers bombarded her with was how long to cook their spaghetti for it to be al dente. This was a personal issue in my household too, because my husband would cook crunchy spaghetti that did not meet my Aunt Lucretia's exacting standards of al dente. And when faced with all of these questions about how long to cook spaghetti or pasta for various and different dishes, Molly O'Neill literally threw up her hands and said, "Who am I to judge anyone's tenderness?" And I feel like this is the perfect metaphor for thinking through the fluid vulnerability theory and understanding who are we to judge the tenderness with which someone may receive conversations and emotions on intense and heavy topics. Objective 2 is to discuss virtual strategies to support safety. A reminder that safety steps occur throughout the process. From the beginning, the registration and platform setup, we used a 2-phased registration process. People registered interest, and then we reached out selectively to invite participation. That registration include collecting phone numbers and an emergency contact information in certain circumstances. The registration and platform setup also includes closed captions. It allowed us to tightly manage group size and make sure that we were managing to the number of faces on the screen. Visual connection and cues do matter in our safety scanning. We considered providing all or some questions in advance, and many participants often let us know that that is their preference because it gives them time to prepare and understand. Our focus groups were relatively simple, and we made the decision not to provide the full guide, but to introduce and repeat the topics so folks knew what they were entering into. Staffing and staffing roles were also critically important. We used volunteer moderators, again, with the intent of better matching to the affinity groups that we were hosting, and also increasing the visible ethnic diversity of staff. The through lines in all of these focus groups was myself serving as a note taker and our sponsor who attended nearly all of those groups from OHA. We also had a technical and support host whose job was to monitor chat, address technical problems, and be there for one-on-one conversations. Moderators in virtual focus groups tend to take a more proactive role, and we anticipate that our moderators will intervene and do intervene if any messaging or sharing becomes too intense. We are grateful for all the participants in these groups. It is because of their willingness to share authentically that these focus groups proved successful. I'm going to share a bit about safe messaging, welcome, and group contact in subsequent slides, but I do want to talk about closure. A wise colleague once said that if you open people up to intense emotional conversation, it's important that you close them before they leave. We agreed with this and put this in practice by having very gentle closures. Virtual focus groups are fatiguing, especially when talking about such heavy topics, and so we stuck to about a 75-minute time timeline, but we then stayed on so that participants could leave on their timeline and on their terms, and often had some additional conversation with folks before they departed. Follow-up with participants was also important, so they knew how they could reach out for aftercare support, and also we gave them an opportunity when they were providing information to get their incentive to have the last word, literally a feedback form that allowed them to state what they directly wanted to OHA to hear verbatim. And of course, processing of recordings and transcripts, the usual attention to de-identification, and also summarizing language and stories in such a way that they can be publicly shared. So specifically, safe messaging, preparation, and communication. The field of suicide is fortunate in that they've spent decades thinking through what kind of language makes sense. It's why there are guidelines not to use words like commit suicide, because that equates suicide with a crime or a sin. There are other language guidelines like that. A reminder, if you misspeak, to correct yourself. That's okay, we make mistakes. And like in all good qualitative research, it's important to adopt participant language appropriately. If folks introduce a new term, ask, is this the group's preference? If you're unsure. If you find yourself on new terrain, if your Google search for messaging guidelines turned up no answers, we recommend that you do a language-focused icebreaker and use language identified by the group. Again, this is good qualitative research methodology. An example of what guidelines might look like is in this blog, How to Talk About Mental Health. So just to share with you some items from our welcome script, here are some ground rules that are pretty typical of any focus group related to confidentiality and recording and the appropriate roles of moderators and participants. But some of the ground rules are much more specific. We want to learn from you and document what we learn, but these intense stories can be difficult to process. Please share only what is appropriate for this short time in this virtual space. Sharing too specific information, like detail about how a person died, can be distressing. It's important to summarize. Reminder that we ask for cameras to be on because we use visual cues to monitor safety. If you need to go off camera, just let us know you're okay so we don't worry. Just tell us you need a minute, use a thumbs up, or reach out in chat. And we actually spend a few minutes at the beginning asking people to pop things in chat and to give us reaction signs so that we know they know how to use features. And finally, safety is our goal. So we provide access to an individual through Zoom chat, as well as the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Our technical and support host is charged with doing a visual scan because we recognize that it's difficult to moderate and do that monitoring at the same time. So what are our support staff looking for? They're looking for noticeable changes in body language, level of participation, and emotional intensity, voice, tears, and eye contact. Any intense or emotive story, even if it's stated neutrally. Stories about psych holds, attempts, substance use related rock bottoms are met with an individualized response or public recognition of what was just shared. How do we respond when we see something or we hear something? So publicly, we might say things like, that is a lot, we're here with you. That is unfair, what happened with you? What happened to you? Sending virtual hugs. By using these kind of reactions in Zoom, hearts were great. You often build group dynamic with folks in the group supporting each other. And finally, we often just take a moment to take a deep breath and ground before moving on to a different topic, question, or personal experience. Privately, we often ask in chat, are you okay? I'm here for support. And that outreach is just received with extraordinary appreciation. So to summarize, what exactly does a safety protocol include? It includes participant phone numbers and emergency contacts so that outreach can happen if something concerning occurs. It includes clear communication about upcoming content in all participant communications, recruitment reminders, tight protocols to manage group size, registration, and late entry. We do not permit late entrance during the personal story sharing. Very deliberative staffing with thought to the content and demographic of group and clear preparation in terms of language and responsiveness. 2 or more staff with a named point person introduced as available for safety checks, visible use of crisis line phone numbers and support resources, and comfort and use of appropriate language. It also includes warm individual connection making during gathering of the group and transparency about staffing roles. A clear welcome script that is read. People understand that we need to follow a script and appreciate that. It does not feel forced. Time spent confirming participant comfort with Zoom features, monitoring of clues, and in the moment responsiveness expressed in the group and in chat. Of elevating positive group dynamics, repositioning when necessary. One of the groups really struggled with group dynamics, and one of the ways I managed that group dynamics as a note taker with a moderator who was new to focus group moderation, but part of the identity group, was actually by coming on screen as the note taker and saying, I am hearing from you how important affinity identification is for this group. So I am going to leave this group so that you guys can have a space that is fully 100% for folks of this affinity. And by departing, I actually generated a revelation by one of the group members that they did not identify as the group, and they left as well. And that identity revelations and discussions really generated an amazing conversation about safe space in regards to that identity. And the group dynamics gelled, and that focus group yielded some extraordinary insights about how to address suicide prevention through mutual aid. And finally, a gentle closure, follow-up email and resources, and individual outreach if warranted. Objective 4 is how and where to refer. So if you are moderating a focus group in which there is a person of concern, we want you to be prepared and know how to respond. Who is in your audience? What might you say? So as a trained suicide prevention, certified suicide prevention trainer, these are some of the things that we practice saying during role plays to prepare us to respond to a person of concern. So I am going to read the first one, and then I'll ask, everyone is off mic, that you just state these helpful things out loud. It's by that kind of practicing and hearing yourself say it that prepares you in the circumstance if it occurs. It's okay to be anxious or scared about conducting focus groups on tough topics like suicide, violence, or abuse. Can I hear you virtually stating these helpful things out loud? These helpful things to say were developed in partnership with folks who experience mortal depression. So the key steps to addressing and supporting a person of concern is training and practice, and it's that preparedness that protects you as well. So here are some of the key steps that we review in suicide prevention trainings. Using one of the helpful things to say, and then opening a conversation. Are you okay? Have you been feeling down lately? How long have you been feeling that way? Asking the question directly, are you thinking of suicide? Acknowledging suicide opens the possibility of conversation and allows someone to seek help. Ask about plans. How would you do it? When? Where? Listen, what's brought you to this place? What has helped in the past? Who's been helpful to you? Show care. State, I'm on your side. We can get through this. It's important to me that you are safe. I want to keep you safe. And finally, offer help. What we're looking for is accompaniment and warm handoff. One of the advantages of the lifeline or text is you can three-way call or stay on the phone while someone is texting. We can call, go together if you'd like. Finally, hope and self-care is open to all. It's important for us all to role model hope and self-care. Just like they say on airplanes, it's important that you put your oxygen mask on first. A reminder that authenticity is most important. This is hard stuff. None of us is perfect, and you are not in this alone. I'm pleased to participate through APOR in a group that is working to push for more standards, more discussion in the public opinion research community to establish best practices and guidelines. And we welcome others in this initiative. And for more information, please reach out to my colleague, Mariel Leonard. There is increasing discussion in the literature on the effects of conducting qualitative research on the vicarious trauma of the moderators, interviewers, and researchers. So I also wanted to provide folks with some introductory resources. There are self-care tools. There's a warning signs overview to think about what to be on the alert for. Everyone must be attuned to signs. Safety planning is a key part of what our crisis line team does in helping people de-escalate from their acute state. Those are available via app as well. So for folks at risk, it's possible to create a safety plan to get them through an imminent risk situation. Finally, again, encouraging folks to take suicide prevention courses and be prepared, and also wanted to share a recent qualitative research article that covers many of the aspects of virtual qualitative research. Much of this work builds on trauma-informed care, and a colleague, Dr. Chris Gowan, has pulled together a presentation that talks about trauma-informed research guidelines generally for both qualitative and quantitative projects. Thank you for your kind attention, and I would love to open up to answer any questions, Krista, that folks might have for me.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. That was, wow, really powerful, and we greatly appreciate how thorough everything was. For everyone who was not able to see a few of the slides that were on freeze for a while, this presentation will be available to you, so no worries about that. I'm not seeing any questions currently pop up through the chat. So I guess I can go on and ask a question while people are gathering their thoughts. You talked about visual scan enclosure. That was something that really stood out to me. And you did touch on how the virtual research component has impacted that. But I wanted to know specifically a little bit more about the challenges you've encountered with doing visual scans versus doing them virtually versus doing them in person, and how that has impacted closure.
Yeah, that's great. So one of the biggest differences in virtual focus groups is that there's less participant to participant interaction, it is much more individualized and one-on-one. So the moderators really take a much more prominent role in interacting with people and eliciting information from individuals. So in the virtual format, there's even more directive to elicit people's input and to just check on them that they're okay, because you do have far fewer signposts than you would in an in-person interaction, where you can also see people interacting with each other. So it ends up being a much more one-on-one dyad than it might be in a group situation if someone, for example, were to get upset or to share a personal story. That said, our groups were really effective at using chat and the reaction buttons to create a bit of community. And again, the groups were really different. So some groups were much more effective, for example, the rural and the veterans group, in creating that community quite quickly. In terms of visual scan, you also have to recognize that you're going to get it wrong, right? People may be checking their email and not be distracted by the intensity of a topic. So you do need to make some real distinctions and be okay with asking in circumstances where there actually may not be an issue. And that's just important. The other thing is just frequent check-ins. I'm trying to think in terms of how that relates to closure. The folks who tended to stay on the lines, I'm thinking of two individuals in particular, were slow to participate, had an affect that actually seemed pretty down. So it was not surprising that they chose to stay on. And we very directly asked at the end of that closure period, are you okay to go? And what self-care practice are you putting into place when you leave? Because we recognize this has been intense. And they might say something like, I'm going to get some lunch, or going for a walk. Does that answer your question?
It sure does. Yes, thank you so much. Anyone else have questions? I'll just do one last scan of YouTube to see if I've seen anything come through. But I wouldn't be surprised if people reach out in a few minutes or later on in the day or even next week with some questions for us to send over to you as well.
That sounds great. We welcome those conversations. I'd ask, if possible, if you could put the evaluation link in chat. I will be happy it sounds like the slide deck will be posted here online, but I'm also happy to send it to folks individually. And I would welcome your feedback about the presentation.
Okay, will do. And sorry, Elissa, just to confirm, which link, is it the one that's currently on the screen?
No, it's not. I can pull it up myself if you need me.
I have your presentation open.
Yep, it's actually not in the presentation. So
okay.
Let me pull it from the email.
I have it in the email. I have it open now. Evaluation form.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
We practice what we preach and recognize that part of what makes us strong is the opportunity to hear from those in their own words. So looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Great presentation. We really enjoyed listening to you. Thanks again for your time. I will post the evaluation form for everyone waiting for the next speaker. Please just hang on, hang tight. Of course, reach out to us if you want to talk more with Elissa or have additional questions based off of her presentation today. Thanks, Elissa.
Thank you again. Thank you, Krista. Thank you, Bill.
Take care. Bye.